Okay. Um, Hello, everybody. My name is Marjorie Cohen, and I am a member of the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. I want to welcome you all back to the hostel. You know, we used to always meet here, um, but then during the pandemic, we had a hiatus, and now we're back, and it feels really great to be back. We've got during the pandemic, we also did Zoom programs. So we're on Zoom tonight as well, and there are about 100 people who have signed up to be with us tonight. Tonight's program really begins our 2024-25 season. Even though I've been out of school for quite a while, I still think in semesters. So I want to tell you just a little bit about the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group in case many of you know about it, but we're a group of neighbors who are just very, very interested and passionate in the history of this area. And what we define as the Bloomingdale neighborhood is from 96 to 100, kind of roughly, but we cover topics that are way south and way north too. So if it's something interesting, we grab it. And we work together to discover, preserve, and share our history. And in order to do that, we have programs like this one tonight that are free and usually monthly. Next month, October 17th, it's going to be on the Strauss family, Isidore Strauss and his family. There'll be someone from the Strauss Foundation. It's going to be called The Strausses in Bloomingdale, the family, the house, and the neighborhood. And we also, many of you are on the tour with Jim tonight, and those are wonderful tours. And they're never the same twice, so you can come back for another one. Our members write blogs, and sorry, I'm sorry. One that Pam Tice has just written is about a suffrage grocery store that was on 95th. In 1913, it was on 95th and Broadway. It's a fascinating story, and I would recommend that you go to our website, which is upperwestsidehistory.org, and there's lots of stuff that you're not going to find anywhere else. It's very interesting. We also have rotating exhibits in the Bloomingdale Library, and we have there also something else very unusual, and that is an archive of materials about the history of the neighborhood that was started by Wynne Armstrong, who's back there. Before I introduce tonight's guest, I want to give a huge thanks to the people who make these programs possible. First, the staff of the hostel, who let us use this fabulous space, this landmark building. Couldn't be more beautiful, and they couldn't be more hospitable. And then second to Michael Gonzalez over here, who is, I don't know what we would do without him. He's our tech person, and boy, do we need him. So I want to, for the reason that you're all here, I read Alexander Stille's book about the Sullivanians, and I knew immediately, probably 50 pages in, that I would like to invite him to come and speak to us. Fortunately, he was willing. He is a freelance journalist and writer and has been a professor of international journalism at Columbia School of Journalism for 20 years. He's written several books, most on Italian subjects, including Benevolence and Betrayal, 5 Italian Jewish Families Under Fascism, and The Sack of Rome, how a beautiful European country with a fabled history and a storied culture was taken over by a man named Silvio Berlusconi. His latest book about the Sullivanians won a New York Society Library Book Award this year and was a finalist for the Gothamist Book Prize. He's a frequent contributor to the New Yorker and the New York Times, and we're happy to add he lives right here in our neighborhood. He will take your questions at the end of the presentation, and for those of you on Zoom, they should go into the chat with the okay. Questions should go in the chat. And then after a Q&A, we will have a book signing. The people from Shakespeare Bookstore are here to help us with that. So, shall we?
So, thank you for that kind introduction, Marjorie, and thank you all for coming. So the way I thought we would do things this evening would be to first give you a little bit of a slideshow so you could actually see some of the people that are in this book. The book doesn't have pictures, and so I thought it would be helpful for you to get a look at them. And then I will read a handful of passages, I promise, for no more than 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll take questions and talk about it. So as you may know, this book is about an unusual community that formed itself in this neighborhood. They owned a building, in fact, at 100th Street and Broadway, and their headquarters on 91st between Riverside and Broadway, and they had all these Sullivanian apartments in the area in between. The group began as a psychoanalytic institute called the Sullivan Institute, and evolved, as we'll soon see, into a kind of urban commune, and then arguably devolved into a cult. The person who was the sort of founding figure is this gentleman right here, Saul Newton, who was a communist labor organizer who fought in the Spanish Civil War, which gave him a lot of sort of prestige and credibility in left-wing circles. After World War II, he went to work at something called the White Institute, which is a very respected psychoanalytic institute that still exists in New York, and was co-founded by a man named Harry Stack Sullivan. And Sullivan was dead by the time Saul decided to found his own institute in his name. Saul had, in fact, no degree in psychology, but he met this woman here, Jane Pierce, who was a PhD, MD, who was trained at the White Institute with Harry Stack Sullivan. She gave him the credentials and the wherewithal to break off and found their own institute in the early 1950s. This is a young man she adopted who figures in my book in quite touching ways. This woman screaming is Saul Newton married 6 times, and he abandoned Jane Pierce for this woman here, Joan Harvey, the one screaming, who was a kind of B actress in a number of kind of B movies that usually involved a lot of screaming, and she did a lot of screaming in daily life as well. This is from a picture of hers called Hands of a Stranger, which is really free on the internet and worth watching. It's really wild. In their early days, they attracted a lot of very high-powered artistic figures, in particular the 2 people on your left. The one on the far left is none other than Jackson Pollock, the famous abstract expressionist, and right next to him is Clem Greenberg, who is a very famous art critic who helped to put Pollock on the map, and at the far end with the sunglasses is Pollock's wife, Lee Krasner. And among the other illustrious early patients, that's Judy Collins, who still lives here on the Upper West Side, who was a Sullivanian patient for many years, from the early 60s into the late 70s. Also Kenneth Noland and his wife Stephanie. Kenneth Noland left, but his wife Stephanie stayed behind and became a Sullivanian therapist. One of the characteristics about this group was that they believed, essentially, one of the core beliefs of the Sullivanians was that Harry Stack Sullivan had maintained that human beings grew through contact with other human beings, that people were able to continue to grow in their adult years, and rather than fixating, as Freud did, on the first years of life. So Newton and Pierce kind of took that idea and ran with it, and so they concluded, well, if people continue growing into their adult years and they need the stimulation of other people to continue growing, then by definition the family is limiting and suffocating. Monogamy, a monogamous marriage, is by definition limiting and suffocating. And so they advise their patients to get out there and see people, sleep with other people, hang out with people, make more friends. So they had their patients break off ties with their families of origin and have lots of sex with lots of people, preferably not your spouse too often. And they had lots of parties. One reason that they were extremely attractive to people on the Upper West Side in the 1960s and 70s is that they had weekly parties, and they also did house shares out in Amagansett. Newton and Pierce and the other therapists all had houses out on the South Fork of Long Island in the beautiful Hamptons, and the patients went with them in the summertime and rented houses. So this is them waiting for the train in Amagansett. More of that. One of a kind of typical hangout. They played softball and had lots of fun. And a lot of people found this a great time for quite a long time. And then in the mid-1970s, because there were lots of creative people in this group, there were lots of people playing music, having rock bands, putting on skits and plays, writing skits. Richard Price, the novelist who was in the group, wrote skits that they performed. And at a certain point, they were having so much fun with doing drama that they decided to form a kind of regular drama troupe called the Fourth Wall Repertory Theater. And they rented the Provincetown Playhouse, which is down in the West Village. This is where, among other things, Eugene O'Neill, the famous playwright, put on a lot of his plays. And so they put on, this is them doing street theater in the middle of New York. This is a place in the Catskills where they did rehearsals. Here they are performing again. And then they took trips to Cuba because they were all communists. And that's part of the Cuba trip. Then they put on anti-nuclear demonstrations where their rock bands performed. This was one of those. Had lots of parties with lots of people. And this is one of the plays. Then they bought their own theater, which they took over with a violent occupation, interestingly, in 1978. And this is a play they put on that's a kind of spoof on, I think, on Wizard of Oz, King of the Entire World, them performing. So that gives you a little bit of the flavor and a kind of basic skeletal history of it. What I think I did in my book that I feel was the most important thing, what I really wanted to do was try to actually get inside of the heads of people and get inside of the subjective experience of what it was like to be in this form of therapy and in this group. And I was very fortunate to have amazing interviews with dozens of people who'd been in the group who opened themselves to me in extraordinary ways. And so I want to give you a little bit of a flavor of that in a way that also gives you an idea of how this therapy gained such a hold on the people that were involved in it. So this is a little excerpt from about one of my main subjects' first encounter with his therapist, and so it'll give you a bit of a flavor of that. Michael Bray entered therapy in early 1973. He'd grown up in a fairly strict Catholic household in western Iowa. After a year in college in Nebraska, he moved to Chicago and entered a Dominican seminary with the intention of becoming a priest. He liked the communal life of the seminary, but realized he didn't believe in God and in the Catholic Church. And he wasn't cut out for celibacy. He had witnessed the violence of the 1968 Democratic Party convention and sympathized with the anti-war protesters who were beaten by the police. He glimpsed the emerging counterculture, but he was a 23-year-old virgin with a degree from the Aquinas Institute of Philosophy. He married a young woman at a Catholic college and decided to become a psychologist. The one graduate school that accepted him was Fordham University in New York City. And so he and his new wife drove there with all their belongings and found an apartment in the Bronx. Bray began his graduate work and also had a job at the Veterans Administration Hospital, but he soon began to feel that his life was seriously adrift. Neither he nor his wife had ever been in a relationship before, had never had sex, and didn't really know how to do either. Undoing the inhibitions developed in preparing for a life of celibacy was not easy. By 1972, they were 2 years into their marriage and couldn't quite figure out how to make it work. When I got married, Bray said, I was a virgin and we weren't quite consummating. We were trying. When he wasn't at work, Bray found himself spending time in the middle of the day, drinking alone and watching game shows on television. He needed to do some therapy for his psychology degree, and a colleague at work named Roger suggested that he see his therapist, Art Libeskind. When Bray showed up for his first appointment, he found himself in the office of a man in his late 30s who was very short, not much more than 5 feet, and had a ponytail. The coffee table in his office was missing a leg and was propped up by a stack of National Geographics. Well, this is different, Bray thought. But as soon as Art, the therapist, asked him why he was there, Bray burst into tears, began weeping uncontrollably, and managed to eventually get out the words, because I'm afraid to be alive. And that, Bray said nearly 50 years after the fact, started my part of the journey. I was basically saying, help me, save my life. I spilled out everything that I could possibly think of. Anything he asked of me or suggested, I was ready to try. And that, brings you to the sort of concept of transference, where the patient transfers this enormous emotional load onto the therapist. One of the next steps in Sullivanian therapy was, after you had been sort of reassured and made comfortable and developed this transference relationship, the therapist would then get you to break off ties with your family. And so this is a little passage that describes the experience of a woman named Carol, who was a black woman from North Carolina. After several months of therapy, Pierce began to make clear that for Carol to really flourish and grow, she would need to sever her ties with her family. In their frequent sessions, her past and family life were discussed in an almost uniformly negative way. Then one day, Pierce convinced Carol to write and helped her draft a letter to her parents, making it clear that she wanted no more contact with them, ever. Carol showed the letter to Pierce, who watched her put it in an envelope and placed a stamp on it, and sent her out to mail it right then and there. She could see the mailbox from her window, and she watched me as I put the letter in the mailbox. I remember looking up at her, and we waved to each other. Having committed what seemed an irrevocable act, cutting her family off forever, Carol felt dizzy with anguish and an overwhelming sense of solitude. When she went to her next session, Pierce asked her how she felt. I said, I feel utterly alone. I feel deserted. She said, well, you deserted them. I said, I know, but I feel utterly alone. Although it may not have been planned as such, Pierce had carried out a brilliant, if devastating, two-step therapeutic judo move on her young patient. She pushed Carol to break her ties with her family and then essentially blamed her for deserting them. It added guilt and self-doubt to the searing pain of loss, leaving Carol doubly vulnerable and needy for the solace from the one parental figure left in her life, her therapist. This would not have worked has Pierce not established herself as a genuinely helpful, empathetic parental figure, someone who in fact went beyond the bounds of the usual therapist, hosting her at home and taking a special interest in her life. So then a brief passage sort of showing the way in which essentially patients' memories were effectively rewritten. One of my main characters, Michael Cohen, lost his father at an early age. And so at a certain point, his therapist asked him to bring photographs, family photographs, into therapy. And so one of them was a photograph of his father with a comedian who was very famous in the 1950s and 60s named Sid Caesar, who had grown up on the same block in Yonkers that his father had. And so here's what happens in the therapy session. The photo was taken on a Florida beach when the two were both adults. Mike Cohen's father, a diminutive 5'1", is dressed in a Hawaiian shirt, and Sid Caesar is in a bathing suit. They have their arms around each other's shoulders. Harvey insisted the picture was not what it appeared. Look at their body language. It's obvious from this photograph they didn't know one another, she told him. In her interpretation, it was clear that Mike's father had been walking along, spotted Caesar on the beach, strong-armed him into posing for a picture the way fans often do with celebrities. The story of that fabled friendship and the photograph Mike had grown up with as a beloved family souvenir, one of the few things he had from his father, and was told it was nothing more than a bald-faced lie, a con. Memory by memory, Cohen's history was rewritten, his brain effectively rewired. The key moments of his life strung together along a thread of malevolence. It was one of the sort of principles of Sullivanian therapy that parents envied and hated their children, resented the demands that small children placed on their parents, and secretly, if unconsciously, wanted to get rid of them. Another passage is about a woman who I gave a pseudonym to, called Penelope, who is invited to a party where all these young female therapists are going to spend the weekend together, bonding in what the Sullivanians like to call chumship. And she's planning on spending the weekend there. And then suddenly, in the middle of all this, the phone rings, and to her amazement, it's Saul Newton. Penelope had never met Saul Newton. She only knew he was the author of The Conditions of Human Growth. When she got on the phone, Newton asked her whether she would like to have a date with him that very evening. Penelope was flabbergasted. How did Newton know who she was? How did he know where she was? How did he know that he wanted a date with her, which she knew perfectly well meant sex? She said no, explaining that she had other plans. After all, she'd committed to spending the entire weekend with her new friends. When she got off the phone, the other women at the party crowded around her, insisting that she'd made a mistake, and urged her to call back and accept his offer. He's the kindest man I've ever met, one of them said. Yes, he was much older, another said. Newton would have been about 66 at the time, and Penelope about 23, but he was, quote, Mr. Natural. She called back and agreed to see Newton. She walked over to the Institute's townhouse. There weren't many preliminaries or much conversation. He moved quickly to sex, which he clearly expected. I spent a miserable night, Penelope recalled. The irony was that at age 60 whatever, he couldn't get it up and was determined to keep trying, so he kept me there for hours. This really happened. I couldn't believe some of the things that people were telling me. But if you've been in a sex cult for 15 years and in therapy for as long, the inhibitions go by very quickly. So the interviews were kind of jaw-dropping. And she found nothing in the least attractive about him. So then another aspect of this group, which was really, really interesting to me, was because this group was committed, was totally anti-family. The problem then is, what do you do with children? And so when some of the early patients got into therapy, some of them were parents already, and the solution to the problem was convincing them to send their kids away to boarding school as soon as possible. I interviewed one guy, by the way, a PhD in math, who sent his sons aged 3 and 5 away to boarding school. Incredible. And the stories of these kids are just amazing. They were, and nobody had ever interviewed them, which was interesting. And I was really happy to have sort of documented that experience. And so this is a brief passage that tells the story of how one of these kids, who interestingly was the son of 2 Sullivanian therapists, both with MDs, both with training, and here's what happens. When Andy Cates was 7 years old in 1971, his parents began asking him whether he wanted to go away to boarding school. He said no. When they mentioned that the older brother of one of his friends had gone away, he again said no, and no again. Then at a certain point, they proposed that they all take a trip together and just look at schools. He wouldn't have to go to one, just look. That sounds really cool, he thought. I'm going to get to go on a trip with my parents, which he'd never done before. I'm going to go on an airplane for the first time. That was a pretty big thing for kids back then. The 3 of them flew up to Maine and rented a car. They drove to see a school that seemed quite attractive and well-run. His parents asked him if he'd like to go there. He said no. They drove away and visited a second school. It was much smaller, with fewer facilities and more disorganized. There were no children Andy's age. The youngest were 10 or 11, 3 or 4 years older than Andy. At a certain point, Andy was speaking to the principal of the school when he saw his parents walking down the hall, heading toward the exit. "Excuse me, I have to join my parents," he said to the principal. "No, you're not," the man said. His parents walked away without turning around or offering a word of explanation, and Andy was left there. That's how I went to boarding school. They duped me. They didn't even say goodbye. They didn't have the guts to say goodbye. So that gives you a little flavor of that, and these kids' experiences were amazing. One of the things that was characteristic of this group, for a long time, they discouraged their patients from having children because of their anti-family views. But at a certain point, as women who had gotten into therapy, let's say in their early 20s, and had been in therapy for as many as 15 years, they were reaching the end of their childbearing years. There was a great demand for these people. These women wanted to have children. And at the same time, they wanted to avoid people forming conventional families. So they often paired people up with people to whom they had no connection. So one of my characters, Michael Bray, suddenly gets a call from a woman he barely knows and says, "I'm planning on having a baby. Will you be the father?" And he then goes, he tries to buy time, and then he goes to see, he realizes that if he says no, he's risking everything in his place in the group. He's now also a therapist in the group. And if he says yes and screws it up, he's equally in trouble. So he goes to see Saul Newton and says, "You have to be my therapist if I'm going to do this." And then he says, "What are we going to do? How's she going to get pregnant?" And Saul explains that there are going to be several men involved, and what happened when women wanted to have a child, the therapist would encourage them to have sex with several men during their ovulation period so that you wouldn't know who the dad was, so that you wouldn't form the kind of possessive bonds that the Sullivanians found so terrible. This is a little passage, it'll be the last I'll read, about a woman named Dee Dee Agee, who interestingly was the daughter of the famous writer James Agee, and who was in therapy there for a very long time. And so she has a child through the same method, where she's basically told she has to have sex with multiple guys. And then when she gets too attached to the child, they kind of move in and try to break that up. And this is a passage that describes that happening. When summer arrived, as Dee Dee and her family were driving up to the group's Catskill workshop, Rachel, the babysitter, told Dee Dee that David, that's the child, had rolled over for the first time earlier that week. Dee Dee was upset and angry. She realized that she saw so little of her child, that she was missing and being excluded from important milestones in his life, learning about them only days afterwards. Then she told me a series of events that happened to her at the workshop. Michael Cohen, who is Dee Dee's therapist, excuse me a second, where her roommates um, were caring for the child on the weekend and didn't allow her to come in, even to spend 10 minutes with the child or decide what clothing was appropriate for that kind of weather. She was angry about this, and she was accused by her roommates of being smothering. The morning after arriving at the workshop, Dee Dee woke up to the sound of David crying outside her window. He had spent the night with Rachel, the babysitter, and was desperately hungry. I went outside in my nightgown in a fury and told Rachel to give me the baby, took him inside and put him to my breast, and then I didn't give him back to her. All day, I held him against me, my roommates glaring and whispering in the distance. I tried talking to some of them, and they all told me that I'd had a paranoid psychotic break, that Rachel was doing what was necessary, and that if I wasn't careful, someone else would end up being David's mother. Her roommates called a special house meeting to discuss, quote, Dee Dee's bad mood about David. Dee Dee told Cohen that she was accused by Rachel in that house meeting of having a mood of horrible paranoia. One roommate of hers was sympathetic to Dee Dee, arguing that it was right, quote, to want to spend 10 minutes with him every once in a while. Saul Newton, surprisingly, sided with Dee Dee, saying, she's the mother, and a baby needs to know who his mother is. At the same time, Newton decreed that Dee Dee would be given a strict time limit for feeding the child, 7 minutes for each breast. This set Dee Dee up to fail. The infant, unaware of the time limit imposed on him, would suck away, eager for food and his mother's touch, while Dee Dee would be looking at her watch, filled with mounting anxiety and then anger as the 7 minutes drew near and the baby showed no signs of wanting to stop. The arrangement almost seemed designed to create the Sullivanian paradigm of parenting, pitting mother against child. The child would inevitably want to prolong the pleasure, nourishment, and comfort of feeding in his mother's breast, while the mother, instead of enjoying this moment of intimacy, would begin to become anxious, imagining the attacks and blame that would be directed at her if she did not meet the artificial time limit. So that's the reading portion of things. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you hear. Yes, please. Great question. The question for those who might not have heard it, either in the back or on Zoom, was what were the economics of this group? How did it work? So in some sense, it was like a pyramid in which the money all flowed up. Everybody was in therapy. So they were paying their therapists, what at the time were, therapist fees. Many of these people were very high-functioning professionals. The number of PhDs, MDs, lawyers, computer programmers in this group were, beyond counting. So most of them were gainfully employed. And one of my subjects, kindly, she had all of her diaries from this period, and she shared her diaries and account books with me. And basically about, a third to half of her money was going to therapy. She was working and paying her therapist. And then those therapists, in turn, would be in supervision with the leadership therapists. So the money was then rising up the pyramid. So they were nicely taken care of. Then there were people who were, let's say younger people in the group who didn't have lucrative jobs, who would make extra money babysitting for the leadership's kids, cleaning house, cooking. Dee Dee Agee, for example, one of the characters I mentioned, was a cook for Saul Newton and his sixth wife, Helen Moses. So they had a fairly comfortable life. Interestingly, the leadership, unlike everybody else, got to live with their families. Everybody else, even if you were married, you didn't get to live with your spouse. That person was in another apartment somewhere else. Men with men, women with women. But the leadership bought this townhouse at 91st Street, And there were 4 lead therapists that all lived there with their many children. Nobody else was allowed to have kids, but they had tons of kids. Saul Newton had 10 kids, although it turned out several of them were not his biological kids for some of the reasons that you can imagine. Um, so, um, so that's kind of how the economics of it work. I hope that answers it. Yes, please. Thank you. I'll be sure to repeat that to the people on Zoom. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, what's interesting, the question was about the kind of parental deprivation that movements of this kind, the kibbutz movement to a lesser degree, the Sullivanians to a more extreme degree, what that entails. I mean, one, the fact that movements like the kibbutz movement and other things was part of a zeitgeist. There was a kind of period of time in which the idea was to rethink the social arrangements and the family arrangements that have traditionally prevailed. And maybe there's a better way to do this. Maybe, so if we raise children communally, maybe we'll be able to create a perfect socialist society. That was kind of the idea, both of the kibbutz and of these people. Um, but certainly, when you talk to the people who went through this, the kids who were survivors of this, um, they ended up being very scarred by it. There's just no getting around it. They suffered enormously. I mean, the sense of a child doesn't understand the logic of a therapy. They only know that they haven't seen their parent in 6 months, or you know, unbelievable stories of one child who is sent away to boarding school. She's 7 years old. She finally gets to come home at Christmas time. Her bus arrives at you know um, at Times Square, and instead of her mother meeting the bus, someone else in the group meets the bus and says, "By the way, you're going to a camp in Connecticut." Turns out the camp is closed. There are no other kids there, and she spends the Christmas holiday with the caretakers of this camp who are surveying. I mean, so these are things. I communicate often with this person, and she's like still working out this stuff, and has had a lot of heavy burdens, and she's doing better than some. Um, yes. Great question. So the question, if you didn't hear it, was what the wider psychoanalytic community thought of this strange experiment going on. And the thing is that I think it was sort of like this dirty secret that like people kind of knew about it, but they didn't know that much about it. They heard the Sullivanians themselves were very secretive about their group, and so that you were told not to talk about it to other people. But at the same time, people were aware. They'd hear stories, they'd hear rumors. They heard they had parties. They heard that all these patients had date books, and they were, writing down these dates in these date books that their therapist would then look at. So they heard these stories, but they didn't really have a deep idea. And at the same time, it was kind of embarrassing that this was all going on, and this had been a kind of splinter group from a very respected institute, the White Institute. So I think it was sort of like the case of, you have a relative who got sent to, got fired from his job from embezzlement, and you didn't talk about it at family reunions. Um, it then blew out into the open in 1990, 1986. A woman who was a patient, who'd been a patient for nearly 20 years and had a child at the age of 41, kidnapped her own child off of right in front, right 3 blocks from here on 100th Street. She, by the way, had a PhD, and her husband had an MD from Harvard and a degree from the London School of Economics. Crazy stuff, but it's true. And so she kidnaps this child who's being kept from her by her therapist. And the husband, who has drunk a little more of the Kool-Aid than she has, stays and then sues her for custody. And the lawsuit then brings this to the attention of a wider public. And then finally, the association, the Office of Professional Services in Albany get word of this, and they begin to investigate, and several of the therapists end up losing their license. So it's kind of the beginning of the end. But so they really didn't know in detail until they then did this investigation. Yes. Yeah, I think, so the question is fallout between the two founders, Saul Newton and Jane Pierce, and things kind of going downhill from there. I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, I think Jane Pierce was genuinely idealistic in her motivation she saw, even though she committed what I would consider to be acts of cruelty, like the thing of separating Miss Woman Carol from her family, she did it out of she really thought this was the right thing to do. Newton was a different creature and was clearly intensely interested in power. And so having established this institute, at a certain point in the mid-70s, late 70s, Jane becomes marginalized. Saul has remarried. First, he marries Joan Harvey, then he marries this woman named Helen Moses. And Jane, they start taking Jane's patients away. And at a certain point, Jane is basically banished. And Jane then, interestingly, goes back to the house where she'd originally lived with Saul and continues practicing. And I think, strangely, continues believing in the ideas that she and Saul had worked out in the book they wrote, but having no more connection to the group. The group at that point became much more cult-like. The creation of the theater, which Jane had no part in, made it a membership organization that you had to pay dues into. And so it became much more structured and much more rigid, and Saul was the unquestioned boss of everyone. Oh, sorry. Yes, that's a great question. The question is whether I spoke to people who felt positively about it. And the answer is yes, although it was difficult because there were a large contingent, a decent-sized contingent of people who stayed to the very end, who were really true believers and who had invested as much as 20 years or more of their life in this. And, they were suspicious of any person from the press poking their nose into their business. And it was hard to get them to talk. I did get some to talk to me, which I was very thankful for. But because I really wanted to understand, the story doesn't make any sense if you don't understand what the attractive pull of it was for people. And so I felt that was really important. But interestingly, when the book came out, I had lunch with one of my sources who was sort of close to a true believer, but not quite. He was sort of had just that little bit of skepticism. He left before the very end because he was disillusioned, but all of his friends had stayed. And so he said, well, my friends are not going to read your book. And I said, okay, that's too bad. Why? He said, well, you're basically asking them to say that they wasted 20 years of their life. And I said, well, actually, I don't believe that. No 20-year period of anybody's life is wasted. 20 years or 20 years of experience. They had experiences. They fell in love. They had friends. They played music. They did other stuff. They misjudged, their therapists and this group. But so I think that was kind of the attitude. And then, interestingly, after the book came out, I got a text message from somebody I tried to interview, but who wouldn't talk to me. And so she sent me a text message that I think included the phrase, "I hope you're too stupid to realize what a scum you are." And so I said, "Phillips, I have a feeling you haven't read my book, but if you want to read the book and talk about it in a civil way, I'm happy to do that, but I don't want to trade insults." To her credit, she wrote me back like a week later and said, "I'm sorry about the rant. You're right. I hadn't read the book. I read a review that emphasized the more sensational aspects of the book. I realize it's more complicated than that. I didn't know a lot of the things that you're writing about here. But you have to realize this group saved my life." And I said, "Look, I would have been thrilled to put that into the book, but you wouldn't talk to me, so I couldn't put it in." So that's sort of the dilemma going, it's an interesting journalistic dilemma. Yes. So the question is, they're believers, but they think they're totally rational? Well, of course, they were all highly secular. They were all atheists. They were very anti-religion. They certainly believed that they were being totally rational. But, as you know, lots of things acquire an ideology that, doesn't consider itself an ideology. That's sort of the nature of it. And part of what I think is, to me, super interesting in trying to understand the psychology of this group and how these really smart, thoughtful people, because I interviewed them, they're like really nice, smart, thoughtful people. I enjoyed getting to know them a great deal. In some cases, they did things that I find hard to understand. But I think you really need to sort of understand group psychology and the way that works, that people in groups do things that they wouldn't do otherwise. There's an incredible amount of cognitive dissonance that takes over. So you think what you're doing is rational because you've entered into a system of thought that's sort of self-contained and totally self-referential. And so you've been told that anybody who puts the group down or criticizes it is psychotic, is evil, is, out to ruin you. So you get into a certain logic that then becomes all-consuming. And so it's logical, it makes sense within a certain, within a certain framework. Yes. Oh, there was somebody behind there who hadn't a chance. Sorry. Sorry, can you speak up? Yeah. To reactions to the. Well, I think that was what was interesting was like, also the people who went into this as adults, even if they were in the early 20s, were making decisions as adults. And so you can say, okay, you made those choices. You got some good things out of it. You suffered some of the things, but that was your choice. There were plenty of people that went into this and after a couple of years dropped out because they just didn't like the feel of it. One of the things a reason why I was very glad to have documented the experience of the children is that I think a lot of the adults, particularly the ones that feel like they're having a great time, they were like, I had sex with, dozens and dozens of people. I played in a rock band. I got to star in a theater show. I never would have had this experience outside of the group. But the thing that I kind of come back to is, here there were dozens of these kids who were sent away and who would come back to New York for a few days here and there. Nobody asked them, like, how are you? Did you want to go to a boarding school? Are you happy? Because it would have interfered with the time that they were having. And so for me, you can't kind of get around that. And to some degree, the people who were in the group have some responsibility and complicity in that. And I think that sort of shook a lot of the people that were like this woman, Phyllis, where, because I remember, when we had a back and forth when I was trying to get her to talk to me, she said, oh, but what you're going to do is going to hurt the children. And I didn't want to say that. I wanted to say, but I didn't, because I still wanted to get her to talk to me, is you should have thought about protecting the children like 35 years ago. These people are adults and they're pissed as hell, and what they wanted was the truth and not for us to cover this up. So, sorry, you had a question? Yeah, it was a super unusual writing project. But I think one of the things that was really important was to have empathy and to be non-judgmental. You're there to listen. You're not there to talk. And I think it was I found that a lot of these people had not talked about this in a long time. Some of the people, the ones who are like true believer types, their social life still revolves around the group and former group members, but they don't talk about the bad stuff. And then others moved away and made friends who had no background like this, and they avoided talking about it because they were sort of ashamed and they thought people wouldn't understand. So when they encountered somebody who wasn't part of it, but understood enough about it to understand why what they did made sense within the logic of the group, they were very happy and so I would have these experiences where I would conduct like a 3.5 hour interview with somebody, and then they would email me back a day or two later and said, can we talk again? This has been bringing up a lot of stuff for me, and I'm remembering things that I hadn't mentioned when we talked. So it was a really, really interesting interview process, and also amazing the things that would come out in multiple interviews. You know, this woman, Carol, whom I read about, I think it wasn't until like the fourth or fifth interview I did with her where she suddenly remembered that she had been involved in the kidnapping of a child who had been sent away to boarding school. And they were kidnapping from the father to send him back to boarding school. And I wanted to say, how is it that we've had like 4 long interviews in which you've told me all about your life in the group, but it never occurred to you to mention this? But it's important not to react that way. It's important just to listen and to realize these people have been traumatized. Their way of processing these experiences is very different. It varies from person to person, and you just have to kind of go with it and then try to make sense of it and sort it out when you're going through your transcripts and thinking about it. Um, yeah. Um, yeah. I wish I could tell you there was some like really deep reason. I just happened to hear about it from a friend of mine who had gotten to know a couple people in this group. And I thought to myself, I've been living on the Upper West Side for decades. How did I know nothing about this group? This group that was forming a kind of utopian community in total secret, hidden in plain sight, you know, 9 blocks, 10 blocks from where I lived. How did I know nothing about it? Just piqued my curiosity. So the lesson to that is be careful what you tell a journalist. Um, Sam. Right. Good question. So, I mean, part of the question is about the relationship between psychotherapy and ideology and the politics of the group. I mean, their sort of premise was that the Soviet Union hadn't fully succeeded in creating socialism because they'd left the family intact. And so, and if you go back and read, Frederick Engels wrote a whole, a famous text about capitalism and the family. And so they were starting from this idea that the family was a kind of pillar of capitalist reproduction. And, they're not totally wrong. Their ideas were interesting in a sense. The problem was, and this is where ideology comes in, I think because they were very sort of strong Marxist, they kind of bought the Leninist idea that Marxism-Leninism was a science, and therefore that the ideas they had worked out were scientifically true. And so if these ideas are scientifically true, then I know that my patient has to be separated from her family. I know that she shouldn't see her children very often. And so I can be cruel to be kind. So as part of that sort of ideological, I think that there's a carryover from their politics into their therapy that ended up justifying, what can be sort of euphemistically called a highly directive form of therapy, in which you tell the patient what they should do rather than allow the patient to arrive at, it's like if you believe that in the Marxist-Leninist view of history, you know which way the history is supposed to go. At that point, there's no hesitation in pushing people in that direction. The vanguard has to push the proletariat toward revolution, and so I think there's some of that that's underneath the psychoanalysis. So, oh yes, oh please, okay.
Were there any connections to the EST or the New Alliance Party from the?
Interesting question. So were there connections to EST or EST and the New Alliance movement? There weren't. It was just sort of part of this 70s zeitgeist. Some of the people I talked to had known people that were in the Weather Underground, which was this armed revolutionary group that was operating in that same period. People had been in other communes. They had been, so there was a whole zeitgeist in which people were, there's something like 3,000 communes that were operating in the 1970s. It was the decade of the commune. It was the decade of alternative therapy. I mean, Michael Bray, one of my main characters, describes going to this psychoanalytic conference in Montreal, and they're doing all these wild and crazy things where, the patients are asked to take off their clothes and pretend to be children taking a bath together, and, all this sort of stuff that would not pass muster today. He lived upstairs from something called, I think it was I think it was called karate therapy or something. And he goes to, explain that the heat isn't working. And he hears a patient saying like, fuck you, fuck you. And so this was, this is remember there's a primal scream. There's Janoff and the primal scream. John Lennon and Yoko Ono were in primal scream therapy. The idea that you would just, like scream the trauma out of your, so this was that era. And so the idea that you would, that there would be a cluster of these kinds of groups is not that surprising. Oh, yeah, I guess there are two more questions, and maybe we'll. I think you in the back were asking. Well, the leaders were, and some of the, the question is whether they were all communists. I think that's a good point. Most of these people just got into this because they wanted therapy or a place to live. And so they moved into therapy, saw that they needed an apartment, they went into therapy. Newton and Pierce and Joan Harvey and Helen Moses were definitely communists. Joan Harvey had a picture of Lenin on the wall of her office. And that the communist element didn't get really emphasized until they formed the fourth wall. And then Newton began sort of referring to the group as a vanguard. We are the vanguard of the revolution. Not everybody bought into that. Lots of people were there for the social life, and they just sort of said, okay, well, we're going to an anti-nuke. They were all left of center. Lots of them had protested against the Vietnam War. Lots of them were sincerely in the anti-nuke movement, they might not have been, true. What's that? Yeah, so I think there was a wide range, but yeah, yeah. And you had a question? Yeah, yeah. So the question is about Jackson Pollock and his end. Lee Krasner blamed the Sullivanians for Pollock's death. It's a little more complicated than that, in that Pollock had kind of a breakdown in, so I think he dies in, is it 56, August of 56. Um, so he fell off the wagon. He had gone through this very creative period where he had been sober and produced lots of work that we've all seen in museums. And then he has a show, I think, in 54. And interestingly, Clem Greenberg kind of pans it a little bit. Jackson is having kind of a crisis. He starts drinking again, is drinking very heavily. And in the summer of, I guess it's um, early summer 56, or maybe it's 55, sorry. Um, Greenberg goes out. Greenberg is in therapy with a man named Ralph Klein, and the therapist goes out to Amagansett during the summer vacation. Greenberg can't stand to be away from his therapist, so he goes, invites himself to all of his friends' houses, including Jackson and Lee's house, and he spends a lot of weekends there. Krasner and Pollock are fighting like cats and dogs, and Pollock is drunk the whole time and very abusive and really nasty to Krasner. And so Greenberg says, you need to get into therapy. You got to stop this right now. He calls up his therapist and arranges a meeting with Jane Pierce. And so this incredible scene, three of these central figures in 20th century American painting, head off in Jack and Pollock's Oldsmobile and drive over to Springs and have this powwow with Jane Pierce. And the result is that Krasner goes into therapy with one person, and Pollock goes into therapy with Ralph Klein, who is also Clem Greenberg's therapist, and sees him during that year. And unfortunately, the Sullivanians thought that drinking was actually a fine thing to do. It released your creativity, reduces your anxiety, and so they didn't put any emphasis on, they didn't see that Pollock's drinking was killing him. And they encouraged him to have affairs, and so he starts making passes to women at the Cedar Bar where he hangs out when he goes into New York for therapy, and finally finds a willing taker in this woman, Ruth Kligman, and starts bringing her out to Amagansett. Krasner, understandably, is furious and leaves for Paris and tells him to get his act together. And then during this period is when Pollock then drives his car into a tree and kills himself and a friend of Ruth Kligman's who was in the car with him. So that's sort of more of the story. But it's interesting, even there was a podcast called Death of the Artist, which was about Krasner, and somebody there gives a quote that's even more pointed than anything I put in my, basically, like they killed Jackson or whatever. So that's it. Very good. Okay. My pleasure.
Yeah. So the recording for this for tonight's talk will be on YouTube tomorrow morning. So you'll be able to rewatch this talk afterwards.